So welcome back to the, now we have the session 1 of Green Growth and Sustainable Development Forum this year, focusing on green innovation. So this session is on mission-oriented innovation for net zero and energy secure future. And I have the pleasure of introducing our moderator for this very important session. Young-Suk Jang, he is the Senior Research Fellow at Science and Technology Policy Institute of Korea, and he's also the chair of OECD Committee on Science and Technological Policy. So with that, over to you, Young-Suk. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for a warm introduction. And this is Young-Suk Jang, the Senior Research Fellow at STEPI, in short. And also, I'm serving as a chair for the Committee for Science Technology Policy. Let me introduce this very much important, the first session. Well, as a chair, I'm really glad that this year, 2022, GGSD Forum focus on green innovation. I'm really welcome that this forum focus on green innovation, because I believe that innovation based on science technology is critical to achieve our mandate, the net zero goals. Having said that, I would like to point out two contexts of this session. The session titled Mission-Oriented Innovation for Net Zero and Energy Secure Future. I would like to highlight two. The first one is there's a growing and increasing pressure for the action to solve social challenges like climate change. And also, there are another pressure, which is growing consensus that the current fragmented strategic and policy framework are not able to solve these unprecedented challenges. This has led multiple experimentation of systemic policies that try to proactively coordinate and integrate various instruments and budgets, skills, and goodwill of public and private actors to solve the targeted challenges. These policies take very different forms, but are generally gathered under the table of mission-oriented innovation policies, which you heard from the opening session. Recently, COVID-19 has demonstrated that targeted collective action can trigger technological and societal challenges in a very compressed time scale. The immediate question is, can this mission-oriented policy do the same for achieving the net zero? So in that, with this background, I would like to introduce a very interesting issue note. There's many issue note and background resources, but among them, I would like to strongly encourage you to read this very interesting issue note, which is do mission-oriented policies for net zero deliver on their many promises? The subtitle is Lessons for Tackling Complex and Systemic Societal Challenges, which is written by my colleague, Philippe Lalou. This background is well described in this issue note that I note. So, This session really focused on several questions. Simply put, the key overarching question is, what is the really different in this mission-oriented innovation policy? And what difference does it make relatively to what already exists? More specifically, this session will address the following policy questions. The first one is, what is the expected impact of COVID-19 recovery measures and high energy prices on green innovation and net zero emission targets? The second question is, how can mission-oriented innovation policy approaches help governments balance and connect support to the deployment of available technologies and to breakthrough innovation? Third is, what governance mechanisms can ensure the coordination required for the successful implementation of mission-oriented approaches? Last but least, what is the potential of mission-oriented approaches to support the behavior and social changes needed for the transition to net zero? So I will use my great privilege of moderator to add my questions, and you in the audience and online will also be able to ask your specific questions directly in the room and through the chat function on Zoom. Okay. To explore these questions through different complementary angles, we have gathered a panel of experienced practitioners and experts of this policy approach. We will start with Anne Mettler, who is Vice President of Europe, Breakthrough Energy, where she is working with to accelerate Cleantech innovation in the pursuit of climate neutrality and net zero emission future, and will set the scene and explain why we need some different strategic and policy SDI frameworks, and maybe in what directions these frameworks should be reformed. We will then hear from the Philippe Laroux and Matthias Weber, who will also give us two different analytical views on a mission-oriented policy based on their knowledge of this policy approach in different national innovation systems. Philippe is working at the OECD Directorate for Science, Technology, Innovation. He leads several activities related to science, technology, innovation governance for sustainability transition, and notably the CSTP project on mission-oriented innovation policies. Matthias is head of Center for Innovation Systems and Policy at the Austrian Institute of the Technology, and invited professor at University Gustave Eiffel, right, in Paris. He is well-known researcher and expert on the transformation of the socio-technical systems, innovations, system analysis, foresight, and governance and evaluation of science, technology, and innovation policy. And then we will have Jolan Maklund and Jennifer Garvey, who is online, will provide the perspective of those who implement these policies in practice in two different type of agencies. One is the systemic innovation, and the other one is for high risk, high return research. Yolan is Deputy Director General of Vinnova, the Swedish innovation agency. He is also the chair of the OECD Working Group on Innovation and Technology. Yolan is particularly interested in system innovation for sustainable transition, and within Vinnova, he can experiment and learn about several new systemic schemes and programs. Jennifer is acting director of the U.S. Advanced Research Project Agency, Energy, better known for ARPA-E. At ARPA-E, Jennifer leads the agency's development, launch, and execution of high-risk, high-reward energy R&D program. So, no further delay, let me invite first Ann Mettler for setting the scene presentation. Over to you.
I'm Mettler. So hello, everyone. I'm very sorry I cannot be with you in person today for the Green Growth and Sustainable Development Forum, but I'm delighted to have the opportunity to talk to you about clean tech innovation in the context of mission-oriented innovation for a net zero and energy secure future. Now, as I think many of us sense, especially those of us who just returned from COP, as I have, we're coming together as the world undergoes profound geopolitical shifts. We're at a turning point in the history of energy, as Fatih Birol, Executive Director of the International Energy Agency, recently put it. And now, the war in Ukraine has demonstrated how energy can and is being weaponized, only adding to the urgency of accelerating the energy transition. So if there is a silver lining in this horrific war, and that is a big if, it's that it now forces us to finally wean ourselves off the fossil fuels that have caused so much havoc on climate, now on security, on the global balance of power. Now, but despite this acute energy security crisis, not only in Europe, but really with ripple effects around the world. Now, I've personally been very surprised that we haven't seen the same kind of breakthrough spirit that we saw when the pandemic first hit in 2020, when teams of researchers from across the globe quickly came together to do what it took to produce a never before seen health moonshot. So whether that was the development of the mRNA technology or the production of a new vaccine in less than 12 months. So we didn't think that was possible at the time. So governments essentially pushed aside whatever stood in the way of producing a vaccine faster than had ever been done before. Now, I have been surprised, also a little bit disappointed to be clear, that even in conditions of war and an obviously worsening climate crisis, and against the backdrop of the very real prospect of massive deindustrialization here in Europe, to now being the region really with the highest energy costs in the world, I see too little of that breakthrough spirit in the field of energy. Now, in fairness, energy breakthroughs are more difficult. Development, deployment, and diffusion of new technologies typically takes decades. The rollout of existing mature technologies continues to be slow. And success is, of course, highly dependent on infrastructure, in particular the electrical grid, which we know needs urgent upgrades. Now, in other words, energy breakthroughs are about systemic change. But so is the energy transition we've purportedly been working on for so many years. It's something we have to do anyhow. So we might as well use this exceedingly difficult policy backdrop after years of pandemic, and now in the midst of a war and an acute energy security crisis, to accelerate a path we know we must pursue. Or, as we like to say in the EU bubble, never let a good crisis go to waste. And that's really the promise of the COVID recovery packages. I have repeatedly called this a once-in-a-generation opportunity to make the energy transition happen, because the amounts of money are huge that we are already spending and will continue to spend. Now, what struck me, though, as governments were falling all over themselves to announce bigger and bigger recovery packages in 2020 and also in 2021, is how little attention was paid to the content of these massive spending sprees. And that's, of course, when we as Breakthrough Energy approached the OECD to dig a little bit deeper into the overall numbers. And the result is the OECD's landmark project on accelerating low carbon innovation through post-COVID recovery packages. Now, the figures that I'm about to present give you an early glimpse of how the energy transition may well evolve, since that's where the money is going. And it also shows what governments are prioritizing and are not prioritizing. So here are some preliminary findings that the OECD team has allowed me very generously to share with you today, and that I feel are very pertinent to the discussion that you set up so well, Young-Suk. So can I go to slide 1, please? Is someone teeing up the slides? Yes. Okay, great. So first off, and very positively, the next slide. COVID recovery packages put a total of $1.2 trillion towards low carbon technologies, $1.2 trillion. It's what certainly must have given Fatih Birol the confidence in making that claim that we are seeing a turning point in the history of energy. If we go to the next slide, you'll see that most of that money has gone towards transportation and energy generation, transmission or distribution. So comparatively little has gone to industry and buildings. And this may well turn out to be problematic now because they consume a large chunk of the natural gas that's now been weaponized and is exceedingly expensive. In fairness, when these packages were first drawn up, it was difficult to anticipate these developments. But it may also well mean that where we can, we now may need to rejig spending priorities in these COVID recovery packages in view of the war, and really put that money to where it can help replace some of the need for natural gas. Then the next slide. So we're looking at the various stages of the innovation cycle. More than 50% of the spending goes to adoption. So this is largely mature clean technologies. This is the bar you see on the slide here in the middle. So if you look on the bar to the left, you will see that less than 10% go to R&D and demonstration of emerging clean technologies. Now, for a world which is in fierce competition for technology supremacy, I would personally argue that's not enough. And also for our climate goals. We know thanks to the IEA that about 50% of the additional emission reductions that are needed to reach our net zero goals by 2050 will need to come from technologies that are today in prototype or demonstration phase. Will 10% of recovery spending really be enough to make a difference here? Perhaps that's something that we can reflect on later in the discussion. We go to my next slide. It's important to say that on balance, the OECD colleagues conclude that compared to the recovery packages following the 2007-2008 global financial crisis, the response to the COVID-19 crisis appears to have placed more emphasis on R&D and demonstration, particularly in these emerging clean technologies: hydrogen, carbon capture, utilization, and storage. And go to the next slide. If you look at this slide, one sees two things. Hydrogen is what I like to call the flavor of the month. So the entire world is now really in a competition to make clean hydrogen happen this time around. The other thing that's obvious is that the US is getting really serious about standing up clean hydrogen, a development that will certainly be further boosted by the Inflation Reduction Act. However, these findings also show that relatively little has been dedicated to nuclear innovation, zero-emission buildings, and large-scale storage technologies, which we know will be essential for the massive rollout of intermittent renewables. Now, if you go to my next slide, so they also underscore the extent to which government efforts alone, even with these massive spending packages, they cannot close the investment gaps. Private sector investment will be critical, as you see here on this slide, where you see that despite, let's say, look at CCUS, for instance, being a top R&D priority, it is nonetheless greatly underfunded if you look at the annual investment needs. So I really encourage you all, and the OECD in particular, to dig into this issue, because innovation in clean technologies is very different from innovation in other technologies. So a lot of our assumptions about what drives private sector investments really need a reality check. And the public sector will need to do a lot of incentivizing, de-risking, and finding ways to blend different kinds of capital. So to recap what this preliminary data tells us, and if you can go to my last slide, essentially good news. Recovery spending or recovery funding has been used to accelerate the energy transition, but we need more focus on technologies that can now quickly replace the need for natural gas, especially here in Europe and especially in industry and in buildings in light of the energy security crisis that we are experiencing. As expected, overall focus is largely on adopting mature clean technologies, but with promising developments in R&D and demonstration, particularly as I just showed in hydrogen. And finally, a massive investment gap remains despite these historically large recovery packages. So future work needs to focus on how to best crowd in private sector capital. And since I work at Breakthrough Energy, which was, of course, founded by Bill Gates, let me also say that I think philanthropic capital can and should play an important catalytical role here in standing up some of these technologies. That shouldn't be overlooked. Now, I will end this presentation as I end every presentation these days. We have a climate crisis. We have a war. We have the worst energy crisis in living memory. We face the prospect of deindustrialization and social strife. Ladies and gentlemen, if not now, then when? And if not through innovation, then how? Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the other presentation.
Thank you so much. Wow, wonderful, setting the scene presentation. I believe you, pointed out, highlighted that urgency of urgency to act, COVID-19, pandemic has provided for the implications for this natural energy crisis. And also you pointed out, the overview of the critical new technologies for this natural research. Probably I would ask the immediate follow-up question, which is that, you probably, for this challenge, we need to, whole of government approach. And also we need to agility. Do you think that it is possible to reconcile both approaches?
Yes, I do. And we saw it actually in the COVID-19 response by governments. Had I had more time, I would have talked a little bit about Operation Warp Speed in the United States, which was for me an example of how government worked to essentially push aside whatever stood in the way of making this vaccine happen. As I explained, it is more difficult to do in energy, but nonetheless, we need that breakthrough spirit. What I was going to say is that the Operation Warp Speed was actually informed and guided by the Apollo mission. And really a spirit, there was a set of principles that underpinned it, which was about agility around public-private partnership, essentially pushing everything aside that stood in the way. I think if we put our minds to it, at least here in Europe, where we are in the midst of this deep crisis, we should be able to make some progress. So I understand the difficulty of whole of government, which means you work across different departments, and agility is nothing that sort of naturally chimes. But in times of crisis, and I used to be a director general at the European Commission, I have seen firsthand when crisis hits, whatever the crisis is supersedes other priorities and other policies. So we need to use this crisis now to accelerate the energy transition, to stand up some of these technologies. I do think there's that opportunity, and I do think at this moment it must be reconciled. We're at times of war. It's a very serious situation here in Europe.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Let me turn to the, we will, have the second round, the 2 rounds of the panel discussion. And I would like to make a note that each of you, please keep your time of maximum 4 minutes, okay, in order to save the time for our Q&A session at the last. Okay, let me first turn to Philippe Laroux. I think Anne has highlighted the urgency to act and some of the limitations of the current STI policy framework. What does OECD research show about how mission-oriented policy can do better than the current policy framework to accelerate this green innovation?
Thank you. Thank you, Chair, and thank you to my OECD colleagues to inviting me to this interesting event. So indeed, we started at OECD STI, this project on mission-oriented innovation policy in 2019 on the basis of this double trend that we could observe. First, of course, this growing pressure from systemic and challenging and complex societal challenges. I don't need to elaborate on that. We're here to discuss about this, and because of that, but also this growing consensus among policymakers and scholars and analysts that there is, or growing even, I could say, disappointment with regard to the current strategic and policy framework in place. Mariana Mazzucato highlighted that this paradigm, the dominant policy paradigm is the one that is based on, one market failure, based on market failure, and one market failure, one instrument. And you end up with a very fragmented policy framework that is not really able to deal with these systemic challenges. And so we've seen this growing acknowledgement that for systemic challenges, you need systemic policies. And when we looked, we looked at different countries and the policy frameworks, and we see mushrooming since 2015, but especially 2018. We've seen more and more of these very interesting initiatives, like in the Netherlands, they have set up 25 missions with clear targets, and they try to team up, they try to gather the different ministries, different agencies to work collaboratively toward these goals. In Germany, they have 12 missions. In Norway, it's not national missions, but at the level of agencies, they have 3 agencies that work together to develop green ships, and they really coordinate the whole process. In Sweden, maybe Göran will tell us about strategic innovation programs where you delegate authority to develop strategic agenda, but also to implement strategic agenda to emerging network of actors. So what we've done at OECD, we started by a definition. We're trying to herd the cats to some extent and try to bring all that variety to a common definition. And the definition that we came up with is that a mission-oriented innovation policy is a coordinated package of regulatory and policy measures that aim to mobilize science, technology, innovation to address a well-targeted challenge. And all this package has different features, but basically it's a package of instruments that top-down, bottom-up instruments, and demand pool, supply push instruments. And we have done a review of the practices of about 25 mission-oriented innovation policies. We have a typology, but basically what we showed is that they all have in common, those mission-oriented innovation policies, to be wonderful platform for collective action. So it's collective action. It's a platform for developing collectively a strategic agenda. It's a platform for trying to align the different plans of actors, of all these actors that you gather around the table so that their investment strategy, their resources are combined. And also it's a platform for jointly implementing a tailor-made policy mix. And so that was the first things we've done, and then we shifted from the design principles of mission-oriented innovation policy and the practice toward these effects. And to do that, we had to focus on one specific challenge area, and we focused on net zero. And the question we ask in our project, and the paper that Young-Suk mentioned is about this, is to what extent this mission-oriented innovation policy approach is better suited, to what extent and under which conditions they are better suited to cope with the challenge of net zero. And what we find, and so to do this, we had to before going to fieldwork, we had to map out the expected contribution from mission-oriented policies. And so we developed with actors a theory of change of mission-oriented innovation policy that showed the causality, the chain of causality of effects that we expect. We don't know yet, but we expect, starting from the design principles of mission-oriented innovation policy, and of course, further down the line toward output, outcome, and hopefully net zero. And what we found in a nutshell is that those mission-oriented innovation policies indeed fulfill some of their promises, and they are very good to do exactly this collectively strategic agenda, this collectively developed strategic agenda, a dedicated structure of governance, tailor-made policy mix. All that is true, and they really are they represent a marked improvement with regard to the framework that we have today. Now, what we see also is that unfortunately they are not yet the systemic policies that we would expect. If you really look at resources, for instance, in France we say that there is no love, there is only evidence of love. So we'll have to look at who is paying for mission-oriented innovation policy, and we see that it's still very much STI money. This is research and innovation funds. We see that who is leading, it's still very much in most of the missions, and we have looked at 74, we have a database of 74 missions, it's still STI authorities that have the leadership. And around the table, indeed, they have succeeded in bringing together different ministries, different agencies, but when it comes to really implementing and dedicating resources, we're still very much, it's still too techno-focused and STI-led. And so there is a need to go beyond that. That will be the next stage. The good thing, and I will end with that, I want to end with some hope. We see that some of the earliest missions, especially, for instance, in Sweden, they started some of their strategic innovation programs years ago, and now they are already moving to stage 2 of mission-oriented innovation policy, and here they go much beyond that. So they really try to improve. So just to say that they learn and they evolve. So we are really looking forward to what's going to happen in the coming years. It's going to be very interesting to see how those missions they innovate themselves. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I congratulate your wonderful work on this, and I guess this work pointed out that definitely mission-oriented policy has some contributions, but not yet the framework that we expected for systemic collective action to that. Let me turn to Matthias. I think that you have a quite a unique perspective as you work at the Austrian Institute of Technology, and you are also a professor at the University Gustav Eiffel. Philip just mentioned that mission-oriented innovation policy are not yet fit for the systemic transformation needed for addressing the climate change. How can we improve the design of mission to address the current challenges?
Yes, thank you very much for the question, and maybe let me try to take a step back and look a bit at the mission-oriented policy approaches that many countries have been embarking upon in the past years. And if there is one thing that is really striking, then it is that missions are actually based on the assumption that we can define reasonably clear targets. Now, we are now in a time where defining clear targets is becoming more difficult because we are facing crises, we are facing wars, and of course, as Ann Medler said before, these crises can be opportunities to accelerate the pathways that we are embarking upon and help us maybe also speed up our steps towards achieving the longer-term missions that we have in mind. But they may also require us to rethink what we are doing. I think the war in Ukraine is certainly a kind of event and a kind of challenge that obliges us to rethink our energy strategies and turn them even more towards renewables and change our energy supply structures, also our global dependencies in this regard. But at the same time, yeah, it is a break, it is a rupture, it requires rethinking and adaptation. And I think one of the very good examples of how difficult it is to react appropriately are actually the recovery plans that have been launched in Europe. And I know the situation in Europe better than, for instance, in the US, of course. And for instance, we, together with Swedish and Finnish colleagues, we also did an analysis of some of the recovery packages, both at national and at European level, that have been launched in different countries. And I would say that one of the kind of key lessons from these packages is that a lot depends on national strategy in the very end. So whether or not these massive investment volumes are used in the sense of redirecting and triggering transitions in our economy, for instance, away from the kind of fossil pathway or not, well, it depends on whether this is seen as a political priority or not. And the three countries and also others that we have been looking at, they differ quite significantly in terms of the kind of balance between, if you like, priority areas, from education to energy to mobility to telecoms, which are all important areas, so they reflect national strategy and political priorities. And also, for instance, they differ in terms of the time horizons at which you want to achieve certain targets. It makes a difference whether you are talking about climate targets at the time horizon 2030, when you will probably need to focus a bit more on diffusion-oriented policies and on innovation-oriented policies, or whether you're looking at a time horizon of 2040 or even 2050. So I think these kind of aspects need to be taken into account, and it means that mission-oriented policies have their place, but that we probably also need to think about a kind of next generation of mission-oriented innovation policies that are more flexible and do not take the definition of clear targets as the ultimate mantra, but rather take them as, if you like, an approach of goal-oriented modulation. You may have rough corridors that you want to follow rather than clear goals. And you need to involve a range of actors and find compromises to mobilize not only public policies across the board and along the lines of a whole government approach, of course, but also private sector, third sector organizations, and not to forget also to convince citizens of needs for maybe also behavioral changes. So this is the kind of agility that we also need to take into consideration. It does not only affect the public sector, but reaches much further, and it requires the ability to adjust to changing circumstances. Now, what does this mean in terms of the capabilities and capacities that the public sector needs in order to oversee and maybe trigger and govern these kind of collective change processes? This is another issue that I guess Göran may tell us more about, because then you are going to be confronted with the kind of capabilities that the public sector actually has, or where the limitations of, if you like, very targeted steering is, and where we need to find a good balance between, if you like, self-organization and providing orientation and guidance. And I think this is very interesting to look at, also against the backdrop of different national policy cultures or policy styles. There is a difference between the way transformative change processes are triggered in the Scandinavian countries or how they are triggered, I don't know, in Korea or Japan. This is very much embedded into long-standing national traditions and governance trajectories that are possibly stronger than maybe the kind of substantive needs of what these transformative change processes require. So these are some of the thoughts that I would like to add to the debate. Maybe let me just conclude on one sentence. I think it's also very important to have very clearly in mind that COVID is different from energy. Ann Mettler stressed that point as well. Investment cycles in the energy sector are different. Getting permits in the pharmaceutical area and in the energy sector are probably similarly long. And these also contribute to, if you like, the kind of differences that we need to take into account when designing the appropriate policy packages to accelerate and shift towards transformations in our energy supply, or in response to more short-term crises that we may be confronted with.
Thank you. Thank you so much. At least to me, you pointed out that the key challenge is to maintaining the long-term perspective in times of, especially, uncertainty is high. And also, you highlighted that the involvement, mobilizing all other actors, including private. This is a very important point that we should keep in mind. Well, let me turn to Göran. Well, I think Sweden is one of the countries leading the mission-oriented innovation approaches, and also among the front runner in climate action. Am I right?
I'm not sure, really. We'll come back to that, maybe.
Okay. I think the country is working on the next generation of mission-oriented policies. Can you tell us a bit more about this, and how are these new generational programs being influenced by the shock of pandemic and the war in Ukraine?
Yeah, okay, great. I would be a little bit more skeptical about the sort of the excellence in this domain. And I will take a step back and go a little bit through a reflection of the history since 2009, when we had the chairmanship in the EU and had the Lund Declaration, when we proposed to the EU to be a challenge-driven orientation in their framework program and all across. So that was sort of a starting point, and Philip has already said something about the learning, and I think we have learned things, and we are now about to sort of launch, and it has already started actually with the first call, the impact innovation, which is a new sort of strategic innovation program, which is supposed to be truly mission-oriented. I come back to that. First of all, we had that challenge-driven innovation program following the Lund Declaration and then the strategic innovation programs. But I would argue that we have not yet what I would call a mission-driven innovation policy, which I think is important, and I will explain a little bit why. Because as Mariana Mazzucato said, what I think is very important, and which I keep my eye on in our internal design, but also when we look around in other countries, are there really clear targets for transformation in? Rarely, really. And I think that is a fundamental thing in the criteria that Mariana Mazzucato put up there. If they're not, we're talking about mission-oriented innovation policy, and we've had that for quite a while. But mission-oriented you may say, okay, it's in the right direction, but it's still not forceful, necessarily. And I would say these programs that we have tampered with have been quite good, but not quite forceful. You know? So if we want really to change or get to transformation, then I think we need to take a next step and really get those bold and ambitious targets in. Next difficulty there is to get the governance structure working. The governance is really difficult, of course, as everyone here has already talked about. You know, whole of government would be the ideal thing. It's very difficult, at least in a Scandinavian country, to have a whole of government thing going for a clear and you know, bold and ambitious mission. So we have tried the second best to do it sort of with the actors and coming bottom up, much more Scandinavian, I think. But COVID-19 dramatically, I think, has changed the mindset that what you can do, you can really work on missions in the government, which I think Ann Mettler and others have said already. That changed sort of a little bit mindset. It was a tipping point, maybe. And we're in Ukraine too, maybe. I mean, we have applied for NATO now, which is sort of a very big step in the country. And the energy crisis would probably generate another step in sort of a strong mission driver. But we haven't seen it yet, really. It's a lot of talk about getting sort of new energy sources which are supposedly green. Other things that are much more promising, I think, or are really promising, is that business in Sweden are leading an industrial transformation up north mainly, based on true transformation thing. Carbon-free steel, it's sort of the electricity of mobility transformation, which is also very much based on batteries. And the north seems to be a very good place because there is green energy. And then you have rare earth metals too, which may be only 5-7 years away, which is important for independence for Europe, you know, and for the transition we have here. So all these things are happening, including the mining, much more sort of green mining. These are happening because business thinks no competitiveness would be gained or be secured for the future without being green. So, and maybe then they could crowd in government, and which is maybe what is happening too now when we're opening the door to the impact innovation. Another thing is the EU mission, and I would say mission on climate neutral cities have changed things because there is a clear target. Carbon-free cities is a clear target. And then we have the climate contracts with the cities. So the demand articulation too. This seems to work, actually. And then finally, then we have the impact innovation, which I hope then will be truly mission-driven. Finally, nesting STI policy measures, which was mentioned, I think, before in the previous session. Nesting STI policy measures with other policy domains is fundamental. And why it hasn't happened before is maybe I've been very curious about understanding why that hasn't happened. The STI is, of course, not a value for ordinary people, but solutions are. So the whole of government may maybe not be the starting point, but in the Swedish case, maybe an outcome. So maybe an outcome where the whole of government comes together, following the business, following the cities, making a sort of true difference in those missions that they generate. That's maybe what we can generate through the impact innovation, which is the new generation in Sweden of a mission-oriented innovation policy. Sorry for being so long.
Thank you so much. Well, a lot of very interesting and valuable insights you just shared with us. Thank you so much. Well, let me turn to Jennifer Garby. You're online?
Yes.
Yep. Okay, good. So far, we have heard about the European experiences. Jennifer, can you tell us a bit more about the U.S. efforts to accelerate low carbon innovation?
I would be happy to. Thank you so much for the invitation and for allowing us to be able to be here virtually. I'm so sorry I couldn't be there, but it's extra interesting to be invited coming from a technical agency, because I think that technology and policy are very intrinsic to each other and need to inform each other. What we do at RPE is very high risk, high reward research is what we fund. But what we really do is ask the question, what problems should be solved and why? And what should that solution look like to make an impact? We are very impact driven and we are very mission driven. And this is extremely important. Our mission is defined by Congress. It's in the law. It's things like reducing energy imports, reducing energy related emissions, increasing efficiency, dealing with nuclear waste, and our energy infrastructure resiliency. And everything we do, we relate back to that mission. That mission is what brings us together. We operate in a very unique way in that we have term limits. So we bring in program directors for 3 to 5 years who start one of these programs, which is this, what problem should be solved and why, identifying the technical gap that needs to be filled in order to move something along on a totally new disruptive path. That's about $40 million a program, more or less, and funding different teams, universities, small business, large business, national labs, in order to do the work necessary to get that to the next step. So we are very off roadmap. We work closely with our teams. Many of our teams take technical attempts, approaches that end up not working, and that's okay. So we have an acceptance of, technical failure, I'll say. We might fund 12 teams, and maybe at the end of the day, only 3 of those technical pathways actually move forward. That's fine. It's high risk. The definition of high risk is most of what you try is not going to work. That's really important to accept culturally. And one of the reasons we can do that is because we have term limits, we're not competing with each other. There's no promotions. We have a very lean management structure. And it's a place where we all work together very closely in order to do these things and inform each other's programs. We spend quite some time putting together these programs and talking with everybody in the country and outside the country. What should these things look like? What kind of potential barriers are there to this tech actually making an impact? To make an impact, the tech doesn't just have to work, right? You have to be able to manufacture it and sell it and use it. And all of these things are important. So we also have a market side to the agency. We have tech to market advisors that are on every program. And we look at these issues in terms of how do we make this impact with this technology. So we are informed by policy in that we see that as one of the very pragmatic things we have to deal with on the market side, just like dealing with cost or manufacturability or something like that. So it's important to know. We are constantly pressure testing our own ideas. And by that, I mean, we have to dig up the bad along with the good. A big part of that is maybe looking at things through a life cycle analysis of carbon perspective, not just a technical perspective. This is important. And I can give you one example because it's already come up today once, which is hydrogen. That's an example where hydrogen itself is a very potent greenhouse gas. If policy does not keep up with the technology, you don't want to be creating another problem that you're going to have to solve again. Hydrogen is also a difficult gas to contain and sometimes sense. So we look at things like that when we are testing ourselves in terms of what could be the next technology. At the end of the day, I think the real benefit we bring are options. None of us can read the future. I wish we could. Nobody knew COVID was going to happen. But one of an earlier investor in mRNA vaccine research was DARPA, the defense ARPA. They didn't do that because they knew COVID was coming, even they aren't that good. But they know that different technical options make us more resilient. And absolutely the same is true in energy. We need more options. So RPE funds things in a very, very broad portfolio. We have programs in fusion and advanced nuclear and agriculture and alternative fuels, transportation and buildings all over the place. And I think that's very important because, again, we are trying to provide options that are not on roadmaps now to help essentially make our country stronger and help with dealing with our energy and climate issues. So, I see a lot of parallels with what happened with COVID. There's obviously a lot of parallels with what's going on with, wars and conflicts that are around energy, because more options make us stronger and more resilient. And that's really the message that I want to get across here. And I also want to give a shout out to Ann Mettler for her comment before, which I actually wrote down and I'm planning on stealing, which is never let a good crisis go to waste. I agree with that so much. I think we should be motivated by that to try to find ways to put out more options to make us more resilient in the future.
Great, thank you so much. Options you pointed out, it's great. Let's, well, we are quite delayed, but let's move on to the second panel discussion, which I would like to go in reverse order. So, Jennifer, I'd like to ask this question. The key challenge is to balance and connect the support to the deployment of the available technologies and to breakthrough innovations. How can missions help to this end? Could you address shortly?
Certainly. I think that, we all have to be aligned in what, at the end of the day, we're trying to achieve, even if we may be disagreeing on how to get there or want to have more options of how to get there. One of the things that we do at RBE is when we look at technology that we funded that worked, we can see that sometimes there's nowhere for it to go. Sometimes the private sector might invest, sometimes it might go to other parts of the government, it might go to defense, but some technology doesn't really have a market yet in this clean energy space, or it hasn't been de-risked enough in order to get investment. So because we have a lot of freedom with what we do as an agency, we started a new program called Scale Up, which actually funds these technologies to get them out of the lab, prove them at a level where they can actually move forward in the market. We are just today actually announcing our awardees from 2021. And with apologies, I actually have to leave this event early to go with the Secretary of Energy to an event where we're actually announcing those. But that's just the first step. And the Department of Energy and the government is doing a lot of work in terms of trying to look at deployment and reducing risk to get new technologies out there. So you may have heard, the bill or the IRA, things that money that's being put towards pathways to enable us to have more deployment. It really is all about deployment at the end of the day. If you don't deploy, you don't have an impact. So there really is a huge focus on deployment at the Department of Energy. They actually restructured the department to allow for this. We have something called, it's not OECD, it's OCED, which is Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations. And we coordinate and communicate with them all the time. And it's all to this end. We all want to see the same problem solved, and we all know that we need deployment to be able to get there. So that was a bit of a long answer to your question, but I wanted to make sure to hit those points, because I think it's just so powerful that you can look at something like Department of Energy, something like an RPE, where these brand new high-risk crazy things are starting, and you can see this pathway of other kinds of funding, whether it's applied offices at the DOE, Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations, at the end of the day, the Loan Programs Office. All of these, you can look at it in terms of a timeline, in terms of when these new technologies can be moved forward. So I think that's very exciting.
Thank you so much. The real importance is that the balancing the deployment and development of new technologies. Thank you so much for your wonderful comments on that. Well, naturally, the follow-up question might be what governance mechanism can ensure the coordination required for the successful implementation and of the mission-oriented approach for net zero. I'd like to ask to Matthias.
Yeah, well, this is a difficult question, and it is probably much easier to say what we will not need to achieve that, and that is probably micromanagement. Now, when it comes to finding some elements of what might be needed, we need to be clear that, let's say, the governance of emissions or governance of transformation processes is a bit like herding cats. you have a distributed agency among not only public sector agents, but also in the private sector, for instance, with their individual strategies and ambitions and goals. So the kind of elements or the kind of instruments that you can try to put in place to achieve soft coordination, as I would like to call it, are manifold. And you can start, for instance, with shared problem perception and vision. This is a kind of soft element of coordination. And for instance, also lighthouse projects that demonstrate that certain things are feasible and that serve as, if you like, strong arguments in a debate about which directions to take. And of course, if you have a lot of diversity of options, as the ones that are developed by ARPA-E, for instance, and you have enough, if you like, demonstration material to show what works and what possibly does not work so well, then this is a kind of, this is a strength in that kind of debate of how to achieve coordination. But there are, of course, also other elements that we can think about. Delegation of responsibility. So even if I'm sometimes a bit skeptical about too strong targets, I'm very much in favor of delegating responsibility to cities and making sure that they, in their respective context, taking into account their specific conditions and the contingencies at play, have the liberty to define what they understand by their zero-emission strategies, for instance. I think this is an important principle of how you can try to achieve that kind of coordination in a sensible way and in a way that does not overstretch the capabilities and the capacities of public sector governance. Another element is thinking more in terms of processes. So, for instance, also in the Austrian context, we are now about to set up, triggered by the European EU missions, a governance framework and governance processes that shall, well, of course, somehow respond to the EU missions, but in the very end, they are setting in motion a process at national level of trying to clarify what we want in Austria in these 5 areas, and bring a community together around those ambitions that we may have, and then try to use also the opportunities that are offered by the EU mission-oriented programs, for instance, in order to move forward along the pathways that are suitable for the specific context of the EU missions in the Austrian environment. So that's also a kind of element of trying to make sure that you generate the necessary ownership, that you generate the networks and communities that really carry these collective actions that are needed in order to realize coordination around missions. Well, these are maybe some of the elements that we could consider. I've been referring before already to the situation that national governance cultures matter, of course, and that there is no one-size-fits-all approach to better coordination. But these are the kind of building blocks that countries can play with in order to define their approach to policy coordination for the achievement of mission-oriented ambitions.
Excellent. Well, once again, the other question might be the whole of government approach. Joran, we often hear that a whole of government approach is necessary to ensure the success of mission-oriented approach. What is your view on this, and what mechanisms are needed to this end?
Well, I don't know really. I think my experience is that it's extremely difficult to get it to happen in a country like mine immediately. But okay, taking sort of up the thread by Matthias here, cities now, in the light of the EU mission on cities, have engaged and signed climate contracts, and of them 21, I think, in Sweden, of which some are ahead of others. They have signed them because, and then they are committed to that net neutral or climate neutral cities. That is sort of an institutional innovation in a way, which doesn't mean that the game is over or we're through or anything. But what it would entail when we are running it forward, which seems to be very promising, in fact, then they would need to generate a whole of government in their cities, which is not an easy thing. Anyone who has been in a city hall somewhere would recognize that it is as difficult, more or less, as at the national level. But if they do that, then they could come out with climate investment plans which cover the whole sort of different departments or in the cities. So that could be a whole of government approach coming from that end. What is also happening then, adding to that, and this has to do with capabilities, by the way. These will build capabilities in those cities. They are then asking the national level, as an agency at the national level, and together with other agencies, okay, back us up. Back us up in our ambitions then, when our ambitions have been cleared. We don't know yet what that would entail, but we have signed as agencies, 6 agencies have signed, we will back you up, okay? In relation to the EU mission on, it's a vertical, in fact, which is quite promising. We don't know yet, but when it comes, then we would need to do a sort of a whole of government, or at least some part of the government at the national level, innovation again, to be able to back it up. But it hasn't been clear yet what they have, and have they been successful in taking their steps. So I don't think we have a solution to the whole of government coming from the top down, but rather maybe now emerging from the bottom, sort of, up, and being a whole of government at the micro level then upwards. That is my hope for a Swedish way now, maybe in other European countries too. I would guess so, because there are other cities very engaged in other European countries in this. But we are very keen on this. So I think maybe, rather than us answering the question how important and how do we do it from a government top-down perspective, maybe this is what I think may become a quite successful way forward. And adding to it, these investments are big in the cities. I mean, this is big, and also a very, very strong factor for demand articulation for city delivery, which also, or for business deliveries. I mean, innovation, business understand that. I see. So that is also part of the recipe for demand articulation, which is so important in Matthias Weber's and Harald Rohracher's article from 2012.
Thank you. Thank you. To me, I think the balance between a top-down and a bottom-up approach is necessary. Okay. Well, let me turn to Philip. One of the policy question is that implications of mission-oriented policies for the behavioral and societal changes needed for the transition to net zero. What is the importance of the behavioral and societal change for the net zero transition, and how we can trigger it, and how can mission-oriented policies help? Well, probably this question is quite related to your answers.
Yes, thank you very much. So, as we said, this capacity of mission-oriented innovation policy to not only to speed up green innovation, but also to transform socio-technical system is one of their main, expected contribution. And as I said before, our study showed that so far, at the stage where they are now, which is very new, they are most of them, as I said, date back 2018, 2019. So they're just very much starting. They are not there yet. They still have a long way to go before becoming those systemic innovation, where they really bring together not only technological innovation, but also social innovation. Just think about the electric vehicles. If you want everybody to have zero emission vehicle, then you won't have Tesla for everybody that allow you to do the same type of mobility pattern. So you will need to get some also changes in terms of how people travel and etc. So that's just, and so missions are not there. But those missions that we have studied, all of them, or most of them, show some interesting way to approach that, an interesting way to try to bring within and to have the societal dimension built in the mission itself, into the design of the mission. And if I can give you just a few examples, but then you will look at our final report that will be out in 2023, early 2023. You take the example of the Irish Challenge program by Science Foundation Ireland. They have institutionalized within their teams of researchers and industry players, they have institutionalized the role of what they call a societal challenge champion. And this person its role is really to integrate into the team of researchers the non-technical expertise and make sure that the systemic dimension, the societal dimension, is kept within and remain within the design of the project. So this person ensure that it will be here all across the process of research and development and demonstration. And you know that naturally there is some tendency to dilute a little bit the initial ambition, and so you come back to some more fragmented approach, and the different people kind of start in their working back in their silo. Same in Austria, in the climate neutral city mission in Austria, they have institutionalized the role of a system transformation manager. Same type of idea. In the Dutch top sector, they have created transversal teams that support the mission team. So you have mission teams in each of those 25 missions that I mentioned, but they also have transversal team, and one of them is for system integration. And again, they try to support the teams with the methodology, the tools to have a systemic approach. They help them develop theories of change, to do workshops, to try to develop collectively the strategic agenda. One key element also of this approach, and what we see in some of the missions, not in many of them, unfortunately, is really portfolio management. And I think Mariana Mazzucato already alluded to that. It's how you go beyond, for instance, funding and supporting projects only for the intrinsic qualities. Of course, you still need excellent and relevant research projects and activities, but you also need, in this systemic paradigm, you also need to understand and evaluate ex ante when you want to select and fund them. You need to understand their consistent fit, how they fit into a broader portfolio project, and together they are going to contribute to the mission. So you see, you don't only look at excellence of individual project, you also look at how they are going to contribute together, all these projects. And that is really interesting. And so there is a lot of learnings from all these experimentations, and of course we hope that OECD, we can be helpful in that, in spreading and formalizing those best practices and trying to spread them throughout the other missions.
Great, thank you so much. Now let me turn to Anne. So far we have discussed the mostly national innovation responses to the climate crisis, but this is actually a global challenge. Tomorrow, the one forum session will address the challenges and opportunities for the international cooperation on green science and innovation. But I would like to hear from you that your point of view on this topic. What do you think is the role of international cooperation for green innovation, and how we can better coordinate national initiatives? Can a mission-oriented policy approach be relevant in an international setting? Anne?
Great question. Thank you so much. Some of you may know Bill Gates actually helped found Mission Innovation, which is the world's sort of premier effort to accelerate clean energy. This was back in 2015. So I have learned a lot from the work with Mission Innovation, which is a grouping of 22 countries, as well as the European Commission, coming both from the global north and the global south. And I think really what I want to share from the experience that I've had and where we try to help Mission Innovation is governments can't do this alone. And really the missing link in mission innovation was always, how do we rope in the private sector, which is notoriously difficult in some of these ministerial and multilateral fora. So I just want to explain a little bit some of our thinking in how to do that better. The first step that we took is really to understand, is to get governments to understand that innovation in clean energy is very different from innovation in other areas, such as digital tech. So innovation in clean technology takes very long. I said it in my introductory remarks. It can take decades. So it's also very risky. It's very expensive. You know, governments have to spend a lot of money, but so do businesses. It's very risky. And the difficulty in innovation in clean energy is that so often the products are not distinguishable. So if you have green steel versus carbon-intensive steel, CO2-intensive steel, there won't be a palpable difference. The same with green fertilizers versus carbon-intensive, CO2-intensive fertilizers. So that makes innovation very difficult naturally. And this is why I believe it's been very difficult on balance, even though, of course, the private sector understands they have to get into all of these technologies. It won't just happen. Governments really need to think about incentives. Let me tell you also something else that we have found and that Göran actually implicitly alluded to. Why is there green steel, so a new emerging clean technology in northern Sweden? It's because there's abundant and affordable renewable energy. So there is abundant and affordable mature technologies in the form of hydro and wind in northern Sweden. And this is why now you have green steel, you have battery production up there. So I think it's important to understand also this cascading effect. You're not going to get businesses to invest in emerging clean technologies in areas where they don't have access to abundant and affordable renewable green energy. So there is a lot to think about here. This is very complex, and this is, go back to the earlier point I made. Governments have to be much smarter about incentivizing private sector to come along and really invest to the extent that they need to. I think that the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, in the US has just done that by putting a very generous tax credit on the production of green hydrogen. Here in Europe, there's talk about carbon contracts for difference. So we need all of that thinking about how do we incentivize, how do we de-risk? One way of de-risking is by setting ambitious targets. So once you have the clarity as a company, by 2030, there needs to be this much sustainable aviation fuel in the mix of airlines, they will have more confidence to be investing in this. So ambitious targets are important because it does de-risk these investments. Blended finance, absolutely critical. Governments can't do it alone, but how do we really put together packages of blended finance, and what kind of finance? Is it equity? Is it loans? A lot of thinking needs to be done around this, around blended finance models. And the last thing I'll say is I always call for a next generation public-private partnerships. I believe that we at Breakthrough Energy are building some of these, especially through a program called Breakthrough Energy Catalyst, which is essentially focusing on technologies that are sufficiently close to market, but that without sort of an active intervention and government and private sector and philanthropy coming together to de-risk would take years. And the hope is that Catalyst can really accelerate what might otherwise take a decade into a much shorter period of time. So Catalyst just recently made the announcement of its first investment in sustainable aviation fuels, and other technology areas will follow. But these areas, and really thinking through how do we incentivize the private sector, that will be important for international cooperation, because by definition, most companies are, at least successful companies, are multinational companies. So they don't think local or even national, they think global. And I think that outfits like Mission Innovation are actually quite well suited to bring the private sector in a fruitful way. But in general, a lot more thinking, a lot more work is needed there.
Thank you so much. I guess the public-private partnership is one of the key for international cooperation, I believe. Well, I apologize for mismanaging time. It is quite delayed. So let me open the floor for picking up a couple of questions to our panelists. Is there any questions? Please feel free to raise your hand. Okay. Would you please give him a microphone?
Thanks. Does that work? Yeah. Stuart Elgee, professor and from Canada. So I want to just hone in on one of the points that you folks got out of the governance and leadership to make mission-oriented programs successful. And I really thought you guys hit the nail on the head, that having these things led top-down from government seems really, really difficult. A government is just not a nimble, risk-averse, horizontal kind of entity. But not having government play ball is also fatal, because you can go with the best idea in the world, they're not bought into it. So I want to just maybe push you to go a little further on this idea of these initiatives starting outside government, but then pulling government in so that they're at the table, they're committed, they can't just sit back and watch and not be committed to it. Are there examples of that working, and is that likely to be a more fruitful way to start these mission-oriented initiatives than to have government feel like it has to own them and lead them itself?
Excellent question. Let me collect if there's another question, let me collect it, and then, okay, over there.
I won't steal your time. Yes, so my question is linked with this whole idea of targets. So across the board, you've talked about European missions, national missions, city missions as a kind of nested contextualization and changing of the targets. Minister Nash mentioned a term which I'm going to take away about value propositions of change. Do you see missions instead of targets being a shared understanding what the value proposition of change is, rather than a specific target? And if so, how do you measure that? What sort of metrics, this is the bad question, what is the metrics or indicators that would you use to look at these contextualized targets?
Thank you.
Sorry, Doug Robinson, CNRS, and the institute that hosts Matthias here in Paris.
Great. Another excellent questions. Apologize. Well, one more. Yeah.
I'll be very fast. So Scott Vaughan with IISD. So thanks to everybody on the panel. I mean, really, really interesting. I mean, one of the striking things thinking about this is this thinking about uncertainty and risk and acceptable levels of failure. I mean, you know, it's quite striking from our colleague in the United States on 3 succeed and 9 will fail. So my question is to Philippe in particular, when you're thinking about theory of change and you're thinking about mission-oriented pathways, I mean, when I'm thinking about governments, they're under a tremendous pressure to prove value for money, that taxpayers' money is being spent in a sensible way, which is making concrete deliverables. When you think about theory of change in terms of these mission-oriented frameworks, how do you think about this degree of acceptable uncertainty to drive innovation? Because that's really what we need. We don't know what we need. We know what we need to do now, but we really don't know how we're going to get there. So anyway, thanks to all.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Since we run out of time, I'd like to ask each of you. You can pick it up, one of the questions, and make a comment just within 1 minute, okay? Yeah. Please.
Okay, I will try to address 3. I think in our case, we are inviting the actors to lead, and that is what we have done. The first question there, even in our first generation, the second generation, and the third, and then back it up with government funding. So that is what we do this time too. In the impact innovation, which is the next generation. And what we do there is to sort of, we invite them to come with the real bold and ambitious, targets. Green steel would not be only green steel if you don't add what Ann Mettler said. You need all those other things in that complex system coming with it. So we wouldn't accept only a technical mission. We would need them also then to sort of cultivate the north of Sweden, which was a mistake 100 years ago, that when everything went back from there, then these societies were sort of impoverished. And then we don't like really the theory of change. We would say hypothesis of change, in which you then have formative evaluation when you deal with uncertainty over time. You then need to embed sort of that kind of innovation management structures with formative evaluation inside. When we used to work with theories of change, they got stiff, over time. And then also, again, I think governments have understood now that sort of that market failure thing about money bang for the buck is not really the thing when you need transformation in order to survive as a society. Now that has changed. That's tipping points, COVID, war, those kinds of things. So maybe times have changed a little bit.
Thank you. Do you have?
Yeah, Göran already made several good points. Just on the leadership, well, to invite others to lead is already leadership as well. So I think this is very much dependent on who is taking the first step. I would actually say, well, the Swedish government has taken a first step as well in that regard. And it depends then very much on the interplay among the different actors. Sometimes the impulse comes from industry, sometimes it comes from government. It's a matter of problem pressure and the matter of politics as well in a democratic environment. Maybe we can discuss at some point at the university, Doug, about the targets as well. I think the kind of contextualization of targets makes a lot of sense. Whether this is in the form of value propositions or something else, that's still to be debated. But I'm very much with you that also not one size fits all, but also maybe one target does not fit all. And on the uncertainties and risks, what is acceptable in terms of failure and uncertainty and risk taking? Well, this is always to be negotiated. We have seen over the past years when these kind of more if you like, scaling-oriented and disruption-oriented agencies have been set up at the European Commission level or in different member states. This has been quite a lot of struggle in terms of the principles of public administration that come into play in terms of not only legitimacy, but also in terms of justification of why you do what and how you can justify losses and failures. This is a tricky issue, I think.
Thank you. Do you have some?
Yes. So, be quick. Okay. So about risk, one possible answer is about the political mandate around these missions that usually have a strong visibility. So there is a political mandate that is going to set, to some extent, the level of risk. Then, just like what Matthias said, there is one of the beauty of missions is that you are going to integrate into a common framework, into a common strategic agenda, the different options, and some of them are more or less risky. And so what you do is that you balance the risk by having different options with different levels of risk, and by that you try to have something that is acceptable by society. And then the third level of response is in the evaluation. You can set up risk if you know that in the end there will be still some level of some accountability. But how to create some accountability for something that can fail? So that has not yet been really developed in missions, and they are really at the very, very beginning of the journey of trying to find the right way to evaluate themselves, to evaluate the missions with evaluation methods that really correspond, that are appropriate for the very nature of missions. As we said, something that, how do you evaluate something that can fail? So that is still just starting. Thank you.
Thank you. Anne, do you want to add something?
With great pleasure. Thank you so much. I wanted to respond to the first one, whether initiatives should take place outside of government. And I would very much encourage that, because I faced a situation like this in my previous job when I was Director General at the European Commission, and 2 Tesla engineers came to see me and my team and said, we have this idea for a company, which of course turned out to be Northvolt, which Goran talked about. And we essentially took the initiative to EIT Energy, which is outside of the European Commission, and they made it a huge success. I mean, Northvolt is up and running. There are now gigafactories in Europe. We got the EIB, the European Investment Bank, around the table. The European Commission stayed involved and gave ownership to the initiatives. But very importantly, we brought everyone across the value chain around, including the off-takers. So the car companies came and said, if you make these batteries, we're actually going to buy them. So we had supply and demand. We had the financing, the EIB. We had the policy-making element from the European Commission. So all of the actors came together, and it put Europe, at least on the map, the global map, when it came to battery production in a very short period of time. I believe this can be replicated in other areas and should be studied. The last thing I will say, because it's something I feel quite strongly about, when I hear theory of change, we need a new theory of change, namely one that we live in an era of constant disruption, pretty much. It's what my old boss, Jean-Claude Juncker, used to call the polycrisis. So a lot of our assumptions are so linear. You know, we work towards this to 2030, to 2050, this, that. We need to rethink that. I always used to tell my old team, less wishful thinking, more strategic thinking, because the fact is that a lot of us see global trends. We see what is on the horizon, but the government apparatus has an exceedingly difficult time to respond in a timely manner and at an early stage. It's a fact. So we need to just develop models that are much more adaptive to this new reality where, you know, a crisis is not an exception, it's the new norm. So let's get rid of this linearity and think about ways. And I thought that the lady from ARPA-E was absolutely correct when she said, what gives us resilience is betting on different technologies. I thought that was very smart. So thinking, what does this new age mean, is absolutely critical when we speak about mission orientation.
Thank you so much. Wonderful. Well, the discussion is very, getting into interesting. But our time is up. But if we can buy a couple of minutes, can I? Okay, then the last very important question, which is that I would like to ask all of our panelists that what is the key knowledge gaps and areas of future work added by the OECD and other organizations. This is excellent questions that we have to ask at this forum. So I would like to ask each of the panelists just 1 or 2 sentences for that, and let's wrap it up. Would you please?
So one of the key knowledge gaps today is how to organize missions to be truly systemic, so where to locate them in national system of innovation, where to anchor them in national innovation systems. Should they be, Mariana Mazzucato says they have to sit on top of ministries, so that means where, what type of budget, do they have to be attached to the Prime Minister office, and of course the response will be different in different national innovation system. And the second question is about what type of public sector capacity and strengthening of public sector capacity and skills do we need to really operate missions. I mentioned portfolio management within missions. You can imagine how much change in terms of mindsets, in terms of tools that those different agencies have to be able to operate that. You have to really to change the whole culture and the whole incentive structure within those agencies to be able to do that.
Thank you. Matthias.
Yeah, maybe just to add to Philippe's list, one important point that I would still like to add is organizational change. So I think that public sector organizations need to change quite a lot when it comes to governing and implementing missions, both in terms of the kind of agility of the internal processes, but in particular also as regards the openness to what is done in what are still the other silos, and maybe establish more cross-cutting networks also across the ministries that are getting a kind of more influential position across these silos of moving mission-oriented initiatives forward and involving those, not only the public sector agent, but also the agents from the other domains such as private sector, philanthropic organizations, third sector organizations for social innovation, for instance.
Great, thank you. Yolan?
There is a long list, but I wouldn't add to the list. Rather, just support the work we have a living lab going on here. Many countries are doing different attempts in different ways. So, but we still have some way to go in order to learn deeply from those. So those studies that you have already started, Philippe and others here at the OECD, and you do, Matthias, we also contribute in looking underneath what is really going on in the mission orientation. Are there really missions? And the governance structures, how are they working? The learning inside, all those kinds of things. Use the living lab. And use it wisely, and with deep learning there, I think that is, rather than adding to the list, just continue and be better, even better at it.
Good idea. And do you want to add very shortly?
I think we need to better understand the interplay between incumbents in industry and young companies. So our experience at Breakthrough Energy is that a lot of the breakthrough technologies come from young companies, but by definition, they don't have the networks and the global reach that big industrial players have. So the innovator's dilemma that played out in digital technologies, I don't believe will play out to the same extent in clean technologies. That's an opportunity. We need to work more to bring the big corporate industrial players together with these young tech-savvy companies that bring so much to the table. Right now, there are very few fora where that takes place in an organized way. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We already run quite delayed, so let me conclude this session. This is an excellent discussion, I believe. And I would like to thank all panelists, excellent panelists, and also the audience is quite brilliant questions as well.